Thank you for coming out. My name is Tyler Grunendahl, and I am the president of Praxis. Dr. Joshua Hall is an associate professor of economics and co-director of the Center for Free Enterprise in the College of Business and Economics at West Virginia University. He earned his bachelor and master degrees in economics from Ohio University and his PhD from West Virginia University in 2007. Hall is currently serving as past president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education and is also a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshua Hall.
Thank you, Tyler. It's great to be back on the Hillsdale campus again. I had the opportunity to come and speak for Praxis, I think 6 years ago, and it's nice to see the campus and the town again. So, and also have a new crop of students who haven't heard some version of my work on the Economic Freedom of the World Index. So I'm going to give you a talk that I give to a wide variety of different types of schools and types of students. I suspect you're probably a little more familiar with the concepts of economic freedom than maybe at some of the schools I give it at. So if any time you think you have a question or want to go deeper, feel free to interrupt. I can certainly adjust accordingly as we go on. So feel free not to hold questions until the end. Okay. So the main themes of my talk are going to be, look, I want to make the case that economic freedom is an important thing to measure and measure well. Sometimes people take the idea that we mismeasure things as an idea that we shouldn't try to measure them at all. I think a lot of good things have come out of our attempts to measure economic freedom, just like I think a lot of good things and some bad things have come out of our attempts to measure the output of society, like through GDP. One of the great things about it is that we have put this data set out there for 15 years now, and scholars over whom we have no control, they just take the data, they download, we don't know who they are, and they're interested in all sorts of questions. They might refer to economic freedom as neoliberalism and have very strong priors against the benefits of economic freedom and go out to try to test some relationship. And they publish papers on this. And so a colleague and I, one of my co-authors on the Freedom Index, we went out, we read all the papers that cite us and data. And I'm going to tell you what we find, but it's almost all good stuff. Even people with very strong priors against economic freedom, the data speaks for itself, and it's almost uniformly related, positively related to good stuff and negatively related to bad stuff. So why study economic freedom? Why measure economic freedom? Well, I'm going to date myself a bit, but I remember going to school in the 80s. And, it's during Reagan's second term, and having intense kind of arguments in classes like political philosophy and economics about what's the best way to organize society. And, on a particular issue or in general, it always seemed to come down to more of a collectivist mindset versus more of an individualistic mindset. And I know that the examples we used were like one data point, right? Like you would mention problems of collectivism. What about Sweden? Well, I realized I don't know very much about Sweden. I might have some example. And it was that type of thinking about let's stop arguing from data points that got people like Milton Friedman and my co-authors on the index, Jim Courtney and Bob Lawson, interested in measuring economic freedom. In fact, how many of you heard of the Mont Pelerin Society? Okay, a handful of you. Mont Pelerin Society, started by Friedrich Hayek in the 40s, kind of worried about where the world was going in terms of collectivism. It was at a 1984 meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society that the Economic Freedom Index was kind of founded as an idea. They were talking, there was a session on 1984, was George Orwell right? And during that discussion, when people were back and forth, yes, he was right, no, he's wrong, Milton Friedman said, hey, we just don't know, we don't have good data on this. I wish somebody would try to measure economic freedom just like there's these now new measurements of political freedom around the world. And very entrepreneurial economist named Mike Walker at the Fraser Institute said, let's try that. Let's hold conferences, let's bring Milton and Rose Friedman together with Jim Buchanan, Doug North, lots of other smart economists, and try to measure this concept. And several years later, that's what they did. Okay, so this is a tough graph to figure out what's going on. It actually comes from the 1964, I think, edition of Paul Samuelson's Principles textbook. So Paul, most famous or infamous textbook, highest selling textbook probably. If your parents took economics in high school or college, they probably had this text. Here it shows it's scaled, so at the beginning of the period, USSR, real GNP, is 50% of the United States, which is set at 100. And what this shows is a couple different projections for the rate of Soviet growth, and a couple different projections for the rate of US growth, and it shows different inflection points where the Soviet Union is going to pass the US. Okay, so we can look back on that and we can say, hey, and many people have done this, what's wrong with Samuelson's model right here? What's wrong with his data, right? Like, so taking, you know, he had some data, maybe I shouldn't have trusted it, but he had some data. The point I take away from it is, that might have been possible, but that's just 2 data points. It really doesn't tell us anything in a way I think is convincing to a large number of people about the wisdom of planning versus more decentralized markets. Now, obviously, we know at the extreme the benefits of freedom generally and economic freedom. It's a very famous picture, I'm not the first person to use this, of the Korean peninsula at night. The reason I find this so compelling is it really abstracts away from all of the common arguments about, you know, why institutions of economic freedom are not so important. I mean, here you have a country that has a common culture, common history until the 60s. You know, same geography, same access to natural resources, to waterways, right? All the other things we think about as impacting economic growth, but this line here changes policies and has changed policies for the past 50 years, and suddenly we have all these lights on at night, and just this teeny light there in the Capitol. Now, again, I wouldn't put much stock in this number. As you see, I'm not using something credible, I'm using the CIA. I don't know where they come up with a number for GDP for, even though United Nations, the United Nations publishes GDP numbers for more countries than the World Bank does. Even the United Nations won't come up with a number for North Korea. So, Milton Friedman very much was an intellectual godfather of the economic freedom of the world project. He was there at all the conferences. If you're ever curious, Fraser Institute has all these discussions, so they're very interesting to read and see kind of famous philosophers, classical philosophers and economists debate over whether something was the embodiment of economic freedom or not, or whether it's more political freedom. And I by any means don't want to think that we don't have those debates ongoing. We audit ourselves every 5 years, go through every single variable. We say, is this capturing this important element of economic freedom? Is it in itself economic freedom? Give you an example that just somebody asked us. There's a human freedom index, and they have gun rights in the human freedom index. And somebody said, why is that not an economic freedom, right? Like, somebody's selling that gun. And I don't have a great answer for why that's in the human freedom index and not in the economic freedom index, except a very pragmatic one is, until recently, there wasn't even a good measure of the gun ownership rights across countries. And that human freedom, and so maybe we'll evaluate that during our next audit. So Milton Friedman writes this in his classic book, Capitalism and Freedom, published in '62, right? He says, historical evidence speaks with a single voice on the relationship between political freedom and a free market. I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. Later on, Milton would be very clear. It's like, I don't know, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Again, one of the reasons we want to get a freedom index is we want to see, are there anomalies? And my co-author, Bob Lawson, wrote a paper with economist from UT Chattanooga, J.R. Clark, looking at this hypothesis, like, does economic freedom and political freedom go hand in hand? Do we see cases where you have persistent political freedom and economic freedom lags or doesn't quite catch up to political freedom? And there are some outliers. So if you think about political freedom, I am going to use the whiteboard, or maybe I'm not going to use the whiteboard. I don't worry about it. I won't use the whiteboard. But if you think about political freedom and economic freedom, you could think, oh, hey, we get more economic freedom, like what do we see in Singapore and Hong Kong right now, right? Political freedom, first we want our families being fed, so we want markets, we want access to markets, and after a while, we begin seeing political freedom kind of being like a normal good for the econ students, right? We now start demanding political freedom. Now, again, that's been very slow. A lot of people wonder why have we seen this in Singapore or Hong Kong earlier. I think that's an interesting question. The opposite might be Israel. Israel has very high levels of political freedom as measured by Freedom House or Polity 4 measures. And they're middle of the pack in terms of economic freedom and been that way for a long time. So maybe these are temporary phenomenon that eventually, once you kind of become middle of the pack, either economic freedom or political freedom, the other ones begin following. But again, it's important to have data to test that. This is my way when I go to other places. I want to try to stop mood affiliation. People who hear the word economic freedom and they already dislike me, right? And so I want to diffuse that situation by pointing out we're just trying to do the best job we can measuring this concept. You might dislike that concept, right? But if someone dislikes that concept, you want me to measure it as good as possible. Why? Because if you think economic freedom is bad for human flourishing, and I do a good job measuring economic freedom, and you want to call it neoliberalism or whatever, you can correlate it and show it's related to all this bad stuff. Right? Whereas if I'm measuring just good stuff, if I put in my index all sorts of stuff like sunshine and flowers and GDP, of course it's going to be correlated with GDP. I'm going to be cooking the books in essence. So what I really want to do is try to measure economic freedom as best I can. I don't know what the optimal level of economic freedom is. That's a value judgment for anybody to surmise. I'm just trying to measure economic freedom, right? And we can imagine that economic freedom involves trade-offs. Very few things don't involve trade-offs, right? One of my favorite Thomas Sowell quotes is, he said, when people don't like economists is, and I'm paraphrasing here, is we tell people there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. I don't think he's quite right on that, but there might be trade-offs. Okay, so this is the index. Just came out about a month ago, Economic Freedom of the World report, and my co-authors, Jim Gortney, Bob Lawson, and some help from Ryan Murphy. What's economic freedom? Well, I always think about a representative person in a particular country. If I wanted to measure, obviously it's going to differ. We have so much heterogeneity within just this room. You can imagine the heterogeneity within a country, right? So obviously our measures of economic freedom are going to be very different and mean very different things to very different people, right? So the thing you care most about, because you have, let's say you have an 18-year-old male and you're in South Korea, probably the most salient issue to you might be the fact that there's 2 years of mandatory military conscription. Right? You're going to be less concerned about the top marginal income tax rate. Okay? We have to produce some measure, and it has to be for some representative person. So we want to think about how does that person, how does government impede their personal choices in the economic sphere? Do they have the ability to exchange both domestically and abroad? Can they enter and compete in markets, right? So are there limitations on their ability to pursue certain occupations, for example, right? Again, it's not whether these things, but maybe those things make sense, right? Even if we think about purely private market regulation, barriers to entry, right, those might make sense. But they are restrictions on, not the private ones, I should say, but those government ones are, even if there might be a plausible reason for it, they do restrain people's ability to enter and compete in markets, and therefore are restrictions on economic freedom. And then finally, for if there are any anarchists in the room, we do have a positive role for government in terms of providing for security of property rights and the rule of law and a sound monetary policy. This is a function of measuring things at the nation state level, right? But it does lend to some interesting issues, right? If you think about a country that, obviously a country dollarizes, that's pretty easy to understand what happens to economic freedom. We treat them just like the country they dollarize with. But what happens if you're like Zimbabwe and you just say people use whatever you want to after the hyperinflation? I would think it's more economic freedom, right? But how do you measure that in the same way we measure monetary freedom in other countries? Anybody know who this is? Isaiah Berlin. We kind of take we are a negative rights definition of economic freedom. Okay. I always say, no one's ever taken me up on it, I would love to see an index that tries to measure positive rights. I think conceptually it would be very difficult to do because of the extent to which positive rights confer obligations on other people. But that's the basic idea behind our index is, individuals possess these certain rights that don't confer obligations on others except to respect their own person and property. Okay, I'll skip over that. This is the first year we have 157 countries. So we only use other people's data, with one minor exception. We do this because we want to be as transparent as possible. We want to take other people's data, and really we're just filtering it through this lens of economic freedom. People have more economic freedom if they get to keep more of what they earn. Right? So if you had to ask, how would you measure whether people can keep something what they earn? Think about data we have. How would you measure people's economic freedom in the United States? Anybody? Come on, somebody's got a thought. How would you measure? I said, hey, I'll give you $10. How would we measure in Michigan how much people can keep of what they earn? Yeah?
Federal, state. income taxes local, just try and figure out how much they're paying in taxes.
Exactly. I'd use like the tax foundations, like if you ever heard of Tax Freedom Day. Okay, you got to work till April 23rd before you get to keep $1 of what you earn, right? That might be a good approximation. So we measure that in terms of from the government side, government consumption as a percentage of total consumption. So we take all the dollars that are spent on final goods and services in the economy, what percentage of those are spent as a result of private individual decisions versus what percentage of those are spent as a result of some sort of collective decision-making process. Okay? Wide variance. We have some countries that are 6%. Hong Kong, Singapore, actually some very weak African states are also 6-7%. Then you have countries like Denmark and Sweden that are in excess of 35. You also have some very weak African states that are in excess of 40. So we take that data from the World Bank and IMF and these other surveys, and we put them on a 0 to 10 scale. Okay. So that government consumption variable I mentioned, that 6, the country that has 6 is going to get a 10. They have more economic freedom, other things being equal than countries that have government consumption is higher. More decisions are being made by private individuals. France gets a 0. Actually, I don't know if that's quite true. That was true in 1990. They were the highest in the world, so they're the benchmark when we set the min. So higher numbers and more economic freedom. And I'll go through a couple of the areas. Check on you. Okay, good. So conceptually, we break down economic freedom into 5 areas. Size of government, so how big what is the scale, and to some extent the scope of government. Legal structure and property rights, right? So there's questions in there. These are all, area 2 is all survey based, right? Because how would you measure property rights protection? Very difficult thing to measure, but we know about the importance of property rights and security of property rights. So the best way we can do that, there's questions like, what probability do you think that your government will expropriate your property? Right? A group called the International Country Risk Guide asked that question to people in a large number of countries. Is there rule of law? Is there military interference in politics and the economy? Access to sound money, we have things like inflation. Is government essentially taking from citizens through increasing the money supply? Are they reducing private transactions by having high and variable rates of inflation? Right? We started the index. This is an extremely important thing. I mean, you had probably the modal country in the world had inflation rates of over 20% annually. You know, that's certainly changed. It's one of huge improvement in terms of economic freedom since we started measuring. Freedom to own foreign currency bank accounts. What's the first thing you do if you're a government and you're inflating the currency? Citizens are going to try to avoid holding their dollars. So you make it illegal. Or you say you need central bank permission to hold other forms of currency. And so the IMF keeps a book and it lists, do you require central bank permission to hold something besides your local currency? Freedom to trade internationally, tariff rates, customs duties, right? Anything that impedes freedom to trade. And then finally, regulation of credit, labor, and business. Look, we have to analytically break these down, but really, I want to be clear, even though we're calling it credit, so you might think about banks, Labor, okay, we think about people. Business, we think about, okay, firm owners. Really, all of those are on people, right? The firm is a group of shareholders and owners. But even if it affects them, it affects the other side of the market and the economic freedom of the other side of the market. So people always get angry at me because one of our variables in there is minimum wage law or mandatory collective bargaining. Oh, you're just pro-business, right? Just talking about saying they can't, firms don't have the freedom to bargain with individuals, right? And workers have power through unions. And I said, it is an infringement upon the rights of individual workers who don't want to be part of a collective bargaining union. Right? That's clearly a violation of, now, yes, do firms like? Yes, but it still is a violation of the freedom of individuals. Within each of these areas, so we have 42 variables across these 5 areas. Each of the areas is equally weighted in the index. So we take each of these 42 components, we put in that 0 to 10 scale, and then we aggregate them up. So in area 1, we have 4 variables. Area 1's worth 20% of the index, so you can figure it out. Government consumption is worth 5% of the weight in the final index. Then we have transfers and subsidies. So what extent is the government taking from Peter and giving to Paul? Government enterprise is an investment. So this is trying to get at that scope. So is the government crowding out private sector activity, either in terms of state-owned enterprises or in terms of excessive borrowing? Right? Are they sopping up all the credit in credit markets? And then finally, the top marginal tax rate. Now, we have some debates around our, when we audit ourselves. So exactly what are we trying to capture there? My viewpoint is we're not capturing taxes per se. Because, right, we'd be double counting if we're doing that, because we already have taxes in here. Any dollar the government consumes has to be taken in taxes. So we don't want to double count. I think a marginal tax rate is trying to get at something that was very pernicious, especially in the early years of the index. We have data going back 1970, was the deadweight loss, those voluntary transactions that don't appear, that come from top marginal tax rates that were 70% in some countries in 1970, right? If you think about one of the huge changes in economic freedom around the world, it's been, if you go back to 1970, you have more than 10 countries in the world that have a top marginal income tax rate over 50%. I think there's only 1 now, right? Again, just to hone in on one of those other areas, we have area 5B. Sometimes you have some things, I want to point this out for a couple reasons. Sometimes you have a little redundancy within an area because it's capturing part of it, but you're trying to get the other one. So the World Bank has this hiring regulations and minimum wage, but it has both of those things in that component. We obviously want to capture the extent to which there are widespread mandatory minimum wages in a country, but we also have hiring and firing regulations in 5B2. Is there centralized collective bargaining at the country level? Do you have hours regulations like France? Right? Is it illegal to work 36 hours a week? Is there some sort of mandated severance? Right? So, like, do you have to pay 6 months severance if you fire someone? Anybody, why might that be an infringement upon economic freedom? Mandatory severance. What if I want to be hired? I know I'm a risk. I might not have the best training, right? Maybe I didn't go to a great school. I want someone to give me a chance. But what's the cost to give me the chance? The cost to give me a chance is 6 months of severance. Right? You're not letting me bargain for terms that I'd be happy to bargain for. It's against the, it's against the law. And then finally, conscription for military purposes or mandatory service obligations. Okay. I mentioned two of the areas that have improved the most since 1970. So global economic freedom just shooting up, right? Like if you go back to like 1980, we have like Peru on our 10-point scale was 2.86. Just hold that number in your head. China was 3. I'll show you what some of these countries are today. Why have they increased? Monetary policy. I'm not saying central banks did everything right, but they got things really, really, really bad in kind of the throes of the Phillips curve, Keynesian inflation, unemployment, thinking that there was some sort of relationship there. You know, there might be problems with inflation targeting, but they're a whole lot less than they were with thinking we can control the unemployment rate. Conscription. The average country in the world in 1970 that we measure had military conscription of more than 16 months. That's fine, we can't narrow it down more than that. Today it has somewhere between 0 and 6 months. And the modal country does not have military conscription at all. And then finally, marginal tax rates. Big changes. Okay, so let's get to the numbers. These are the top 10. In 2013, I would say we measure everything with a lag. Right? Because data take time to appear. You gotta remember, at the end of the day, there's somebody there writing it down. So I use tons of data, which rather than making you, actually makes me super, super skeptical of data. Because you'll have things like the World Bank will just update a whole time series for a country, like, oh, really? GDP fell by 3 percentage points only last year from when it was, but all the way back in time for 10 years. Interesting. No. So these, I'm very skeptical about data quality. That doesn't mean I don't use it. It just means I remain very skeptical about what sort of picture it's presenting. Does anything strike anybody odd about this? Right? Is anything like, hey, I wouldn't have thought this. So all those Hong Kong, that's first, Singapore second, right? USA 16. No, it's all what you thought. UAE, fifth most free country in the world.
One thing I think is a little weird is how much of a gap there is, especially towards the beginning, between like Hong Kong and Singapore and New Zealand, and then just how much closer it gets once you're looking towards like UK and Chile and the United States. It's kind of weird how those gaps are occurring.
Yeah, there's been, so if you guys cover GROW, if you ever cover growth, there's an idea called Convergence in growth theory, right, that countries, because it's easier to catch up, right, poor countries will converge towards richer countries. I just finished a paper on institutional convergence, and we do see convergence in institutions across countries, and we see economic freedom. And part of that is the decline at the top, right, so maybe you begin seeing some bad policies. Like the US was second in the world in 2000. Right, so we're converging towards the middle. China is converging towards us. I'll show them in a second, but remember, I said they were third, or sorry, their score was like a 3 in the 70s. Okay. So, yeah, there's a huge gap both at the top and the real bottom, but we've seen kind of everybody not only rising, but the extremes falling off. And I guess that's expected as the world becomes more globalized. So the thing was on the EU. I wrote a paper on, is the European Union good for economic freedom? There's many policies within the EU you would think be very bad for economic freedom. But on the other hand, there's free movement of people, and some of the worst kind of agricultural subsidies they had to end to send to the EU. So my paper on net shows that it's better, but in some areas it's worse. Especially now, there's a lot of like regulations coming out of Brussels, and that seem to be spreading out. They can spread out all at once, so it's not. My prior would be more decentralization is better for economic freedom, but certainly U.S. is a case, and it was probably better for economic freedom that we are a confederation of states rather than being separate countries. So anybody can guess why the U.S. has fell? It's a trick question. We've fallen for just about every reason. I really wish I could point to something. It's been continuous. You name the people in office, it's fallen. We've fallen in Area 1. Right? Some of that pretty obvious. You can think about the Great Recession, all our shovel-ready projects, all of our cash for clunkers. Right? You're spending money, not providing anything that increases output. Government consumption is going to go up relative to total consumption. And then we haven't returned back in that. M1's gone up. We haven't seen in the inflation numbers, but money supply has gone up, and that's one of our measures. So that's been a change. Since 9/11, it takes 4 times longer for a good to clear customs in the United States than it did in 2000. Okay, that might make sense. I'm not a national security expert, but nobody seems to be talking about that as being a cause. Maybe there's some other cause for that. Regulation. Regulations are, like pebbles in a stream. Pretty soon they begin blocking that stream, and we've seen a continued increase both under the Bush and Obama administrations in adding regulations instead of taking them away. But the biggest decline, and the one that's difficult to explain, is in Area 2, rule of law and property rights. These are survey-based questions, so I don't know why they're declining. But people who answer these survey questions, it's a random sample, right? People who answer these survey questions across three different groups that ask these, so it's not even like one survey. It's 3 different surveys by 3 different groups. They think the rule of law is declining in the United States. They think property rights are less secure. You name it, we're declining in those questions. So I'm troubled, right, because I don't know why. I can guess, right? Is it, I don't know, the war on terror? Is it Kilo v. New London? The Supreme Court said, yeah, it's okay to take one person's property if it's going to provide more tax revenue in the hands of somebody else. Right? I can come up with stories. But to me, the bigger issue is, think about all those things I said about why economic freedom increased around the world. Those were all things where it was easy to know the solution. Okay? Economists convinced central bankers, not that they should become free bankers, but that the Phillips curve didn't work, and they should inflation target. And that, hey, being on the backward bending part of the Laffer curve is not good, right? So we should cut marginal tax rates. And Milton Friedman convinced people in the United States and other economists convinced people around the world that a voluntary army is more efficient than a conscripted army. We know how to solve those problems, right? Like, we change a line on a form, and the marginal tax rate goes down. How do we change an erosion in property rights? We don't know what's really causing it, right? And if it's like a disease in the body politic, I don't know how to unring that bell. So as somebody who cares very deeply, not about the measurement I can free, but the thing itself, that's what I'm most troubled with about the U.S. decline at 60. Are we great for the world standards? Yes. But we're losing something that we figured out long before many other countries. And one of the reasons why we were in the top 3 since 1970. Here's just some other major countries, no rhyme or reason except maybe population, and people often ask about. So the colors here correspond to quartiles. Just keep that in mind. Blue is top 25% of our 157 countries. Green is the second quartile, yellow is the third, and red's the fourth. So remember the question earlier about, so again, a lot of very close, but again, we go back to 1970, I said, remember, Peru was a 2 something. China was a 3. So people say, well, what about China? It's amazing what a little bit of economic freedom will do. Right? Their score was a 3. And now, remember my point about the representative person in a country? So I'm pretty sure we don't have one for Liechtenstein because it's too small. But if we had an economic freedom measure for Liechtenstein because they had data, I'm pretty sure it'd be pretty representative for most people in that country. China, I'm pretty sure our number's wrong for most people in the country, just from the standpoint of those eastern provinces are so much more economically free than the western provinces. Like most people don't know, China still has internal passports, right? If you want to move to Beijing or Shanghai and work, like, you need permission to do so. And so there's been tremendous improvements, and we've seen that in growth. But China still has a long way to go. We shouldn't forget that even though the economy is very large, the country as a whole is still very, very poor. There's the bottom 5. Syria, Chad, Libya, Republic of Congo, and Venezuela. Every year when the index comes out, libertarians around the world email us and they're angry. And why are they angry? They're angry because of this. Like people from New Zealand, libertarian New Zealanders, they're really angry about, I don't know this to be true, I'm just giving an example. They're forcing us to have low-flow toilets, and it's tyrannical, and how can you have us third in the world? And you know what the email response is? Have you been to Venezuela? Right? Yes, I understand that gets your goat. But people have private cars. They largely make private decisions with their money. Yes, tax rates are high. But it's nothing compared to, Chavez, for the past several years ago, nationalized a hotel that he had bad service in. Right? That doesn't happen in New Zealand. Okay, I should say for which we have data. You might say, why not Cuba or North Korea? There are holes in the map because we don't have data. Right? I'm pretty sure most countries we don't have data for. The other 51 countries, depends on how you define a country. Other 51 countries are either too small, your Liechtensteins, your Vaticans, right? Which counts as one of the 208. They are their own country, world's smallest. They own data, or they're oppressive and don't produce, or poor and don't produce the data. But we still have 94% of the world's population, I think. So let's bring it back to that debate about George Orwell's 1984. By these broad swaths, I'm not trying to downplay the specific differences across these countries, right? Because again, if you care about healthcare or you care about something, specific policies matter. But by the broad swath of economic freedom that has been lived since 1970 as we've measured it, the Scandinavian countries are a lot, maybe less so in 2000, but a lot more like us than they're like Venezuela, right? And in fact, they're much better than us, only in terms of economic freedom in many areas of the index, where they do very, very poorly as size of government. They do bad on marginal tax rates, they do bad on government consumption as a percentage of total consumption, But where they do very good is they do well in terms of freedom of trade. Those declines we've seen, they recognize that part of doing well economically and being able to support those welfare states is being open to trade, having actually very dynamic labor markets. So they have very low, relatively speaking, labor market regulations, right? They're more like us and less like France. Okay, so what's the outcomes? We have a few minutes left here. What are the outcomes? Again, these are correlations. There's other studies I'll talk about. There's correlations. Here we have GDP per capita. All of the graphs I'm going to show have this format. Okay, we've got red, least free, second quartile, third, most free quartile. Okay, so they're all going to take that format. $32,000 extra per capita income, most free quartile compared to the least free quartile. Again, these are PPP numbers, so again, trying to adjust for different purchase power parity across countries. Here's the troubling thing for me as someone who cares about the world's poor is we think about the idea of convergence. Convergence is like, oh, hey, we invent something that has real cost reductions, right? Lowers costs, lowers transactions costs, lowers real production costs. We had to spend money on R&D and come up with that. They should be able to cautiously adopt that technology. And just as my 9-year-old grows, he converges towards me. Maybe they should converge towards us, right, in height. We don't see that. These are conditional convergence rates. The least free countries are growing at a slower rate. This used to be 0, by the way. One of the hidden stories is Africa's growth tragedy is turning around. Growth rates are picking back up in Africa. Again, there's been a lot of positive institutional change. And so this is now at least rising, because most of these are sub-Saharan African countries, not all of them. But we're ahead. These most free countries tend to be higher incomes, but we're growing faster than the least free. Okay. And again, not surprising if you think about one of the ways they're not free is they don't allow trade. So the convergence assumes that these ideas are costlessly adopted, and no, the government's get in the way of them being costlessly adopted. This is just a survey done by Jacob de Haan, who's now an economist for the Norwegian Central Bank. Used to be at the University of Groningen. He's in some ways skeptical of the index, but even he grudgingly says most studies analyzing the relationship between economic freedom and economic growth and economic freedom have employed cross-country growth models. It's clear from these studies that EF seems to have a positive association with growth. None of the studies summarize reports that economic freedom is bad for growth. Now again, you might be like, well, duh, right? But think about, again, this was not an argument that would be well received 35 years ago, even among a subset of economists. Well, no, planning, more centralized decision making might be associated with higher rates of economic growth. So that at least showing that economic freedom or liberalization is not bad for growth is actually a pretty surprising outcome for some people. So we talked a lot about income shares, especially in the United States recently. Really no difference, it's just noise here in terms of what share of income goes to the poorest 10%. Why the poorest 10%? That's what the World Bank measures, is the poorest decile. Okay, you can think of it like the iron law of share of income from the bottom decile, it's roughly 2.5%. But, as my co-authors like to say, people don't eat income shares. They eat out of income. So the question is, would you rather have 2.5% of very low levels of income, right? And so in the least free quartiles. The bottom 10% have average incomes of about $1,600. And the most three quartiles, it's almost 10. Now again, would I like to live on $10,000? No, but it's probably a whole lot better off than living on 1,600. Okay, I'll skip over that just in the interest of time. Just more surveys showing, hey, these relationships hold up in a more systematic way besides these just bar charts. It's not just income, although I think this operates through income. You get to see your grandkids. You get longer life expectancy. Higher incomes afford you the ability to take care of yourself. My grandmother swept. She's an outlier. She did live to her 90s, but she swept up tobacco leaves in a tobacco factory for like 30 years. What do you think that did to her health, versus her grandkids, which, for better or worse, are going to do no manual labor once they pass 18. Part of economic freedom is the freedom to fail and getting rid of failures and trying new things. So it's not surprising that more economically free countries not only have more business failures, they also have more business starts, right? So business failures are not a bad thing. They're actually a good thing. Those are resources that are freed up to be used by other people. The last thing we want is our best and brightest trapped in firms that are being propped up. Okay, I'll end with this. I talked about how other people take our data and run with it. I was really curious, because I have my priors, right? I only largely measure economic freedom. I want to know what people are doing with this. I want to see what people are doing with the index in a really systematic way. So Bob Lawson, my co-author, and I, we looked in this database, Social Science Citation Index, and we grabbed every single paper that cited the Economic Freedom of the World Report. And we coded them. And these are across economics, political science, forestry, sociology, you name it. Like, there's actually, it's not in this group, but there's a Journal of Metal Music Studies. That's the name of it, the Journal of Metal Music Studies. And we are cited in the Journal of Metal Music Studies. Apparently, economic freedom is positively related to the number of death metal bands. 748 distinct authors, and then we code them. We say, look, hey, is it a throwaway site? According to this index of neoliberalism, okay, that's a throwaway site. They're not using our data. Is the outcome they're measuring in an empirical study good or bad? Are they looking at growth? I'm going to make the normative claim, growth is good. Right? Somebody might say, growth is good. Improved air quality, good. Right? Some judgment called inequality. It's not obvious to me inequality is bad, right? I for sure know forcing equality would be really bad. So I don't know what to make of any move towards more inequality. Again, it depends on what the starting point is. And then, is it a core variable? What I mean by core variable, did they use the word economic freedom in the title or abstract? And what we were trying to get at with that was like, do people who come in with a prior are calling it economic freedom versus somebody who's just using it as a statistical control, do they find something different? Because you might think people who are like interested in economic freedom are just going to be blinded, not dishonest, but they're going to be blinded and choose the regression specifications that serve their cause versus somebody who doesn't care. And I got this idea from Robin Hanson from GMU, who does like health econ. He says, if you want to know the effect of something, only look at the variables that are not in the title of the paper. So if it's on the effect of X on obesity, don't look at X. Look at the other things. And those are the true relationships, right? So what do we find? There's 178 empirical papers. Only 7 of them are associated where recorded as normatively bad. So fewer than 4% of the relationships were economic freedom was positively related, okay, went with a bad outcome, or negatively went with a good outcome. 3 of those 7 were economic freedom corresponds to greater income inequality. But there's 3 other papers that find that economic freedom is related to more income equality. So that's very much a split issue. The other papers are like ones on environmental equality, which we do tend to see a very long run improvement in environmental equality as economic freedom increases. Economic freedom increases leads to more growth. There's something called the environmental Kuznets curve. Getting high enough growth, people want to demand better environmental quality. But in the short run, you can get the environment, air quality or whatever decreasing. And one of the papers finds that, for example. Okay, so there seems to be some trade-off between growth and income inequality, but everything else, growth is all positive or thing, you name it, it's all good. Again, there's probably 45 or 50 different dependent variables in there. People are interested in deforestation, water quality, you name it, lots of stuff. Okay, so I think there's still important issues remain. I think the index, at least scholarly, has helped us win the battle on, at least among economists, on big scale economic freedom being bad for growth. Now you can't publish a paper because they want to know about specific policies, right? So you have to narrow down your focus, but at least we've won this level, kind of the battle. Okay. I think the biggest thing looking forward is better understanding why some countries change in economic freedom and others don't. That's the one thing we don't understand. Why does economic freedom change? Is it because of the power of ideas, as in Milton Friedman and conscription in the United States? If you've never seen that story, I would Google it. There's a great Economist article on it. He basically convinced this commission, single-handedly, of military folks that a volunteer army was better. Or is it more decentralized? Hey, our country liberalizes, and we see all the benefits of them liberalizing, and so we liberalize. But anyway, I am out of time, so I will stop there. I will say those. I know you're in your close to midterms here. If you're writing a paper, our website's a little clunky, but the great thing about it is all of our data is here. And you can pull down a nice pull down information for a country. But there's a database that has all the world development indicators and all of our EFW variables in there. It's web-based. You can create great charts like this. And we list all of the, or almost all of the titles and abstracts of papers that cite the EFW there. So it's like it's an instant literature review. So I will stop there and throw it open to question.
Yeah, we have about till 8:05 for questions. If anyone has to leave, want to be respectful of time, so feel free to do so. But yeah, open floor.
Yes.
In regards to I've seen a lot of data in the last few years, but I haven't seen as much data that goes a lot further back, like the 50s or so. So over maybe say the past 100 years, what would you say the trends are for countries that have gone up and countries also that have gone down as well?
We don't have systematic data on there. There's an economic historian in Spain who's trying to create a measure from, I think, 1850 onward. But you can imagine, like, a lot of this stuff, it's a really limited number set of variables, right? My sense is it's in many cases, one step forward and 2 steps back, at least like economically. Now, the economy tends to be, what happens is the areas, we get like, for example, Uber, which comes in, at least in a lot of cities, drastically breaks up, overcomes what Gordon Tullock called the transitional gains trap, and overcomes this and basically leads to a kind of deregulation. But then we get this kind of creeping other types of regulation that are hard to undo. Ours is a static measure, like, so the maxes and mins are set to a particular point in time. So you do see among the top 10 in 1980 a decline, right? And you see these, like UAE and Ireland, drastically increasing. So all I can say is that of the countries we measure continuously since 1970, there's been a large increase but some high-profile ones at the top have declined. Certainly, in terms of score, we are 8/10 on our 10-point scale. You know, we're 8/10 of a point down. To put that in perspective, there's been studies that show that 8/10 of a point is worth about 1.5 percentage points of annual growth. So it's kind of scary. Like, it's unclear whether the studies do that hold for the U.S., but just use that as the back of the envelope. That's the trade-off, right? Yeah, you want to follow?
Just wondering, like, for instance, for the top 10 countries or whatever, what would be the point in that they were the most free versus other countries which were, what time were they at their least free?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't know that, but that would be really interesting to look at, like a individual maximum, right? Like for each country, and where do they relate to that? Yeah, I don't know that though. Yeah.
Out of all the countries on the index, which one are you most skeptical of their position? Like, you think that the data on that country is particularly bad or something like that?
There's two answers I'll give to that. One's a systematic one. What don't we measure well? What we don't measure well is countries where the data does not reflect the equality to all citizens. So mostly I'm thinking of countries where women don't share the same rights as men, and the surveys reflect the rights that men have that women don't. I think a lot of Middle Eastern countries would do far worse if we could find a way to accurately reflect. And there's somebody working on, Rosie Fike, who just finished a PhD at Florida State, just presented some results to us where you take the difference between men's and women's rights and adjust our property rights measures and see what happens, right? And for some countries it's exactly the same, for other countries there's huge gaps. And so that's a broader thing, but I think it's very important, and we're gonna look very seriously in our next audit trying to correct that. The other one is, I think, Haiti. And this comes from, we have certain internal rules for what happens if you're missing one data point. We have 42. We don't want to throw out a country because they're missing one data point, right? But we also don't want to include a country if they only have 23 of those 42 variables. So our rule is you have to have at least a majority of the data points in each area for us to include you. Well, Haiti is missing just under half of the variables in the legal structure of property rights. And they're exactly those things we would think they would do badly on. So I think they're like in the 60s. And I'm sorry, that's too high for Haiti, but the data is what the data is, right? So all you can do is recognize that doesn't feel right. I'm gonna investigate further. Oh, hey, my priors were wrong. Or how can we get at this in a way that we're getting more accurate over time? Did you see a question back here?
No,
No?
sorry.
Oh, okay.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious how you work with something like the surveys, because I know polls on the public about economic and political issues, even relating to like objective facts, like what's the inflation rate, are notoriously inaccurate. People just don't know like the reality of like the political and economic systems. So how did you work with those on measures where you don't have objective data to fall back on? Like I know you mentioned how secure do you feel in your property rights?
Yeah, so on the one hand, obviously you're not gonna just trust things that make no sense. Like, so I'm not gonna, if this outcome told me people are super secure in their property in Rwanda and in Norway, they feel really insecure, I'm gonna be skeptical of that data source. So there's some of that, there's some data sets that like make no sense. Like, you just can't, people are like, why don't you use that? I'm like, go look at their numbers. They like, and they're variable from year to year. Even if, so first is kind of, does it pass the smell test? And then, in some sense, all I care about is it an accurate way of people are feeling, and do I think there's systematic issues within or across countries? Because if what I'm trying to measure is a decline, so there is a decline, the same exact question, asked to like the same set of types of people across countries by some of these surveys, and there has been a decline among developed countries in people's feeling about the rule of law and security proper rights. So I don't know what that's reflecting, but that's reflecting something. Good. You would, our thoughts were leading in the grades. Okay, people are pessimistic, and so it's affecting that. But nope, they've continued since expansions happened, and so real big puzzle. I don't know. But I mean that's a worry. But remember, almost all other data is survey too, right? And that's the thing I gotta remind myself. Things we think are hard data, at the end of the day, there's some government bureaucrat or some official writing something down in a book, and we treat that like it's a hard thing, and it's usually not. Like obviously a top marginal tax rate is, like we know what that is, but government consumption, that's a guess. It's a guess, an educated guess, but I guess.
All right, that's all the time we have. So thank
Okay.
you, Dr. Roll.
Thank you very much.